Hello everyone, welcome to my watercolor painting channel, and today we're going to be painting together this beautiful collection of autumnal finds such as mushrooms, berries and leaves. But first, a little announcement about my upcoming book. Hi friends, I am here with some exciting news. I have just received the first copy of my new book called Painting Woodland Watercolours, and I am over the moon. Let's have a first quick look through, and you are the first ones who's seen this. This book contains 20 step-by-step tutorials painting woodland animals, insects, mushrooms, plants, birds, and also has some essential information on how to start, which art supplies to get, and most of my watercolor tips and tricks I have learned over the years. You can pre-order this beautiful book now, and I know that it will be released in States on 14th of October and then 30th of October in the UK and probably the rest of the world. So thank you so much. Let's get back to it. So I will start this tutorial with just showing you how I draw, and if you're unsure how to draw, you can always download my line drawing and then use it for your painting to paint along with me. So first I'm just using my pencil, just a normal pencil, and I'm using Arches 300 GSM cold press paper, 100% cotton. Very important if you work with watercolor to use a good 100% cotton paper. So I will be creating a composition of a few mushrooms, berries and a few leaves, and then we're going to be painting them together. I've attached my paper using masking tape to the board to just minimize buckling of the watercolor paper. So for the first layer, we're going to be painting this orange mushroom in the middle, and I'm using my brush size number 8, and I am going to be applying water to the whole area of the mushroom, and we will be working wet on wet. So wet on wet technique means that we have wet surface of the paper and we are going to be working with wet brush. That's why it's called wet on wet. So very important to apply water to the whole area so it's glistening, so no dry spots. and then I will be using my brush size number 3, and I will mix two colors, so it will be cadmium yellow hue and cadmium orange hue. And I will start applying it wet on wet using my brush size number 3. You don't need to cover the whole area of the mushroom with this color. You just dab in a few places, and because you already have water, the color will travel on its own a little bit. And it's very important to have these lighter areas because that's what makes watercolor beautiful, the contrast between light and dark areas. And now I left some of the areas untouched, as you can see, in the middle, and I'm using just a bit more of cadmium orange. You can see it looks a lot more orangey, and I'm adding it with my brush size number 3, wet on wet, and it instantly just lifts that mushroom, and it's such a beautiful color. I love it. Another great technique that you can use called lifting the pigment. It's when you are using big size brush, it's slightly damp and clean, and with application of some pressure you are lifting some color while the surface of the paper is still wet. I absolutely love using this technique, one of my favorites. We're going to be painting another mushroom, so just a cap. I will use the mix of burnt sienna and cadmium orange hue, and this time we will start wet on dry, but you can see that later I will still use water and I will have to work a little bit quicker in order to achieve the smooth layer, first layer that we're going to put. Now adding burnt sienna, wet on wet, using my brush size number 3. Now we're gonna work on oak leaf, so I'm applying water to the whole area of the leaf, very gently, making sure there is no dry spots, and I'm using my brush size number 8. Immediately I'm starting with olive green, wet on wet, so using my brush size number 3, and then I'm adding on cadmium yellow hue. You can see it looks more like a yellow color, there is no green, and I am just mixing those colors together, and then I'm grabbing some more cadmium yellow, and bear in mind that I don't need as much water because we have water on the leaf, so I'm even with my brush sort of collecting that excess water and then wiping against the tissue, and I am keeping it light. And then I'm adding a bit more of cadmium yellow hue, and it also has a little bit of cadmium orange as well. Now I'm gonna add more concentrated olive green, wet on wet, using the same brush, brush size number 3. Now I'm adding Perylene green mixed with burnt sienna, wet on wet, with my brush size number 3. Because this surface is so wet, we don't have hard edges and all those dots become like blooms, and this is the effect that we want. And then I'm loading my brush with very concentrated burnt sienna, and I'm adding that color with brush size number 3 to the edges of the leaf. I'm now creating a second mix to paint a few objects, and it's a permanent rose mixed with a little bit of dark sand purple, and I will be painting with a brush size number 3. First I'm starting with this tiny leaf, and then I will be painting another leaf and starting it first. I'm using just the tip of my brush first, and then I'm adding a little bit of cobalt blue in the mix, so I just want a difference on the leaf, so not just one color. I love to have plenty of different colors. So you can see that I'm finishing off with this cobalt blue mixed in, and just a tip of my brush that I use, and then I will be also painting wild blueberries. Perylene green and burnt sienna mix I'm adding to paint the needles from pine tree, and I'm using my brush size number 3. Also using the same color to paint stems for berries, so it's Perylene green and burnt sienna, brush size number 3, wet on dry. Now let's paint blackberry. So I'm using a very weak mix of cobalt blue and permanent rose. You can see it contains a lot of water, and I'm using a tiny brush, so size 2-0, and we're painting wet on dry. So I'm just doing the circles on blackberry, and you can see that they are slightly different sizes, and they have all these beautiful purpley colors. Another type of watercolor technique that I use is called wet on damp. So when paper is damp, you have more control over the color, and it's brilliant to add a more saturated colors on top of the surface. So I'm using lamp black, and I'm adding it wet on damp with my brush size 2-0, just to some edges of my oak leaf. One of the best ways of creating shadows and watercolor is using complementary colors. So we have our yellow orangey mushroom, so we look on the color wheel, and opposite it will be a purple color. So we're going to be using mix of yellow and purple color to make a shade, and I mixed it on my palette, and then I started adding it wet on dry with my brush size number 3. And as I'm going down the stem, I also used a little bit more of orange color, and I am sort of activating the whole area of this stem, and then I will be working wet on wet, just increasing the intensity of the color. So now you can see that me grabbing a bit more of Dioxazine purple with some cadmium yellow, and I'm applying it wet on wet, and it just produces beautiful color, beautiful shadow color. Now we're gonna work on a stem for this orange bolete mushroom. So I'm using my brush size number 8, and I'm just applying even layer of water, making sure that my water will go all the way to the pencil mark, so no dry spots. And you can check it by lifting and tilting towards natural light. If it's glistening, that means that you have enough water and you applied it everywhere. If you have dry spots, that means you haven't applied it there. And then immediately after applied water, I'm using a weak raw umber applied wet on wet with my brush size number 3. And also in that mix I am adding Prussian blue. You could see that blue color that I've just added. This is Prussian blue. You don't need the full saturation of the color, but just as we are progressing you can just add more saturated spots, I'd say. They are still light, and we also have to remember that any cold press paper, well, most cold press paper, they will dry out 20% lighter, so these colors won't stay as bright. Now once everything is dry, I'm using the mix of Dioxazine purple and Cadmium yellow hue, and I use brush size number 3 to mix colors, but to work I will be using brush size 2.0 because it's easier and it allows me to make those tiny little brush strokes. So we're gonna work on the mushroom, on the yellow mushroom that we have, and we are working wet on dry. So you could see that I'm pre-mixing a bit more of purple color, and we're gonna add details, so we're painting the area under the cap of that mushroom. With cadmium orange hue and my brush size number 3, I'm adding some bright orange color wet on dry, so you could see how the color looks on my palette on right hand side. Let's add some shade on our orange bully mushroom. So I'm using a mix of cadmium orange hue and burnt amber, and I'm applying it with a brush size number 3 wet on dry. Notice how concentrated that mix, and it didn't have as much water as we used for the first layer. Now I'm adding a mix of lamp black and Prussian blue wet on damp using my brush size number 3. If the stem on this mushroom dried out, you can reapply water first and then add that mix on. Now let's add veins to the oak leaf. I'm using the mix of Dioxazine purple and Cadmium yellow hue with a brush size number 3, and I'm adding it wet on dry. With a mix of cadmium orange hue and burnt sienna, I'm just gonna add details using the tip of my brush size number 3. So I am now adding darker shades on the mushroom, so not everywhere, just in some places, and with a little bit of burnt sienna it also brings up very dark orange color, and I love combining it with the rest of the colors on that mushroom. So, and then I'll be placing just a few lines on top of the mushroom using my brush size number 3. I've also added Prussian blue diluted with water with my brush size number 3, just in a few places on the cap of that orange mushroom. And the reason why I'm doing this is because the whole mushroom overall looks very warm, so I want to create a better balance by introducing cooler colors to work with. So now I'm introducing darker shades under this cap on the orange mushroom. So I'm using Dioxazine purple mixed with cadmium orange hue, and I'm placing that saturated color right under the cap first, and then I wash my brush, dump it against the tissue, and then I'm just with some wetness in my brush blended it with the rest of the mushroom. So we have a very nice shade under the cap. I'm using the mix of Dioxazine purple and cadmium orange hue, and I'm applying it with a brush size number 3, wet on dry. So you can see that not much water in the mix, and I applied it sort of in the middle of the mushroom, and then with clean brush I'm just dabbing it round to make it more to make it blend better on the right hand side and left hand side. I've just mixed Dioxazine purple and lamp black with my brush size 2.0, and we're working wet on dry. So now we're gonna add final layers to our berries. So I am with this mix adding it wet on dry around individually around all circles on my blackberry, and then I will be using the same mix to add on blueberries as well. Now adding more texture to the orange bolete, and I'm using a mix of raw amber and Prussian blue. Notice that it is very light, so don't use a lot of both colors, so use plenty of water. And I'm using my brush size 2.0, and we're working wet on dry. And now I'm adding lamp black wet on dry with my brush size 20. So orange bolets, they tend to have like loads of tiny black dots, and I am using just the tip of my brush to paint dots and very short brush strokes as well. So we will be adding those bright details at the end, working very slowly, and you can see that I'm using my tiny brush for that, and it's just that lamp black color that we're using. I've also used just the tip of my brush and this lamp black color to paint some roots, and it's very important to have a pointy brush to do that. And also, as you can see, that I'm working quite quick to produce these lines, but if you're unsure, you can use just a gel pen. So one of the last stages will be adding the darkest shades, and I will be using burnt sienna mixed with Dioxazine purple. You can see how saturated that color is on my palette, and I will be adding it wet on dry with my brush size 20. I also will paint some of the lines on the mushrooms, but I will try to make sure that it's a lot darker, so don't be shy on Dioxazine purple in that mix. And we're also going to be painting inside, so on top of the cap as well, and it instantly brings it together. And then mix of Prussian blue and lamp black I'm adding to the orange bolete, and I'm adding it right under the cap to paint shadow. And also I will be putting some dots using the same mix of Prussian blue and lamp black. I'm still using my brush size 2-0. And now my little painting is complete. I hope that you enjoyed this little tutorial, and I'll see you guys later. Bye!